I read books and, you know, I'm listening to audiobooks and stuff, I can do other things. I can fold clothes, I can wash dishes, you know, I can cook, whatever. But with this book, because I was highlighting so many things, it was impossible for me to do anything else. When you ask someone for a book recommendation, this is not what I would expect anyone to recommend someone. Yeah. Hello and welcome back, or welcome to my channel. If you are new here, that was completely fake because there's actually nothing in this cup. I just wanted a reason to show this on camera because hello. Anyway, we are going to jump into the first installment of another series that I'm starting. Yes, another series. So I have my read it or watch it. I have my 5-star exchange. I have my year of the series. The Does It Work series is making a comeback this year. So yeah, I have a couple of series that I do on my channel already, but we're doing another one. So this series, if you cannot tell by the title, the thumbnail, because I don't know what either of those things are going to be yet, or my shirt, my paraphernalia, my cup, my merch in the background, if you cannot tell, this is a Vampire Diaries inspired series. So in this series, I am going to be reading books that was recommended to me by members of the cast. This series is going to include recommendations from cast members from the Vampire Diaries, but also cast members from the originals. And this will be a series that I roll out slowly over time. This isn't going to be a series that I just dump all the books into September. This is going to be something that I do over the course of time. So all of the recommendations that I'm going to be reading are legit recommendations that I got from these individuals. I didn't like go on their Instagram or send them a message or something. Like, I met these people in person and I asked them, recommend me a book. Like, tell me a book that you really enjoyed. What's a book that you would recommend? What's the last book you read? And they all gave me recommendations, except for one cast member. They did not give me a recommendation, and I had to solicit a recommendation from their significant other. But that's a story for another time. And they could choose anything. There were no limits on like genre or page count or anything. I just asked them for a book recommendation and they gave me whatever their recommendation was. So we're gonna start off with the werewolf recommendation. And I actually went to the bookstore, I went to Barnes & Noble, and I picked up a couple of the books that I got recommended to me just so that I would already have them and be prepared when I did eventually start this vlog. So we're going to head over to the bookstore and go pick out some books. Welcome back. So I went to the bookstore, as you saw, and I actually had to have the store clerk help me find the books because I had never heard of these books. I didn't even know what genres they were. Therefore, I had no idea where to look for them in the store. Turns out they were actually all in the same general section. Even though they aren't technically the same genre, those genres are all near each other in the store. So every time we would go over there to get one book, we would go back to the computer to look it up, and we would look up the next book, and it turns out it was back. So we just kept going back and forth to the same section. And after a while, she was just like, let me just see if it's here before we go back over to the computer. So we are going to be jumping into our first recommendation, and this is a book that was recommended to me by a werewolf, one of my favorite werewolves. I know that other people may disagree, and that's totally fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and sometimes people are wrong. You know, it's okay to be wrong sometimes. I'm not, but sometimes other people are. So we are gonna jump into a recommendation from one of my favorite werewolves, and that is Mr. Michael Trevino himself, also known as Tyler Lockwood. So when I talked to Michael, first of all, he was so sweet, so nice and kind, like so gentle, like the exact opposite of what you would expect from Tyler himself. Like, I was internally freaking out and fangirling, and just being that close to him, listen, it was a lot, okay? I composed myself, but on the inside, chaos, okay? And he actually, along with quite a few other actors, gave me a nonfiction to pick up, and I had never heard of this, like I said before, but it is called The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. Now, I don't know what this is about. I did not read the synopsis of any of the books that I was recommended because I kind of want to go into them blind. I feel like I didn't want to have any preconceptions of like whether I would or would not like it. If I read the synopsis ahead of time, then I would kind of like go into it with a certain mindset or a certain like preconception, and I didn't want to do that. There are a couple that I was already familiar with because I have recognized the title. But I would say overall, the majority of these were books that I had never heard of before, which is kind of fun to get to test out and read a bunch of books that I didn't know anything about and books that are not super popular, like on TikTok or booktube or whatever, and just kind of get an idea of like what other people who are outside of the booktube world and the book talk and the bookstagram, like people that are outside of that, like what are regular, everyday, like non-social media obsessed people reading. So yeah, this is the audiobook. I'm going to be starting this on Libby. I am currently at my house and the physical copy of the book is at my mother's house. So I will be listening to this while I'm kind of getting some stuff set up, building some furniture and doing other things or whatever. I'm going to be listening to this. And then I guess once I go back to my mom's house, I'll be able to read it physically or like hybrid read it or whatever, which hybrid read it, Tyler. Apparently this has a guided journal that goes along with it, which depending on how I feel about this, I may decide to go back and pick up the guided journal. I don't know yet. We'll see. I will check in with you guys once I've got about 25-30% in. This is a shorter book. I think this might only be like 6 hours on audio. So it's kind of on the shorter side. Again, it's nonfiction, so I don't know how dense it's going to be. But yeah, I'm excited to check this out and see what the hype is about. See why Michael recommended this. Currently at 61% of this book, at least that's what the audio says. And this book is just wow. That's really all I know, like what to say. Like I was not expecting this book to hit the way that it's hitting. I'm like, how do you even describe this book? This book is very much about being very introspective, being very real with yourself, being very real with the world. That idea that like you are so small in the grand scheme of like life, and the fact that this world existed long before people were ever here, and it'll exist long after we're gone. The world will keep spinning, the galaxy will keep, you know, doing whatever the galaxy does. Kind of like taking a step back and just learning to like observe the world instead of getting so involved in the world. And I think that that's a concept that you definitely have to be in the right mind space, the right headspace to be able to like accept that and understand that and really want to like take that and apply that. This book also talks about like vibrations and energy, and I talk about the samskaras. And if you're not ready to get into all that kind of stuff, I don't think that this is a book that I would recommend, because you're just going to read it and be like, wow, this is a bunch of mumbo jumbo. But I think that if you are in a place where you want to learn more about letting go and just being free, like that's what I would say this book is about so far anyway. It's very much about learning how to free yourself from things that bind your psyche. And there are going to be some people that are going to be very open to this. There are going to be some people that are very like, this is stupid, or this is dumb, this doesn't work, whatever. But if you are someone that is at least open-minded, I think that this is one of those books that you can't just read this book one time and be like, okay, now I'm fixed, now I'm healed, now I'm enlightened or whatever. I do think that this book is a little bit of like an oversimplification. I feel like the way the book is written, it's not necessarily the stuff that's in it, but more so like the way that it's written. It's kind of written as like, oh, it's just so simple, just free yourself, just do this. Like one of the examples that it talks about is like smoking. It talks about the easiest way to stop smoking is to not pick up any more cigarettes. Like just don't put a cigarette in your mouth. Like that's the way you stop smoking. It's not by all these mind things that you do and all these things you tell yourself to try to trick yourself out of or distract yourself from it. At the end of the day, the only way to stop smoking is to literally stop smoking. Like just don't pick up a cigarette. But the way that it's worded, it's like I get the point of what it's trying to say. Little less than 40% to go, and I'm hoping to maybe finish this tonight. It is day 2 of the Mystic Readathon, so yeah, hoping to finish this tonight so that I can move on to a different book tomorrow. So, I have finally finished The Untethered Soul, and the ending was not what I expected. First of all, this book delves into this whole thing when it talks about like death, and like death is like pretty much my biggest fear, I guess, just in a general sense. Even though it's like inevitable, it's still like a fear of mine. And so the fact that this goes very like deeply into death and like the acceptance of it, I was just like, ooh, okay, I hear you. I know that you're talking to me. It also took an interesting turn, which I, again, was not expecting, but didn't mind. I think I said in the last clip that I was interested to see like where the book was gonna go, you know, that kind of thing. And so I am quite surprised that it went where it went, but I enjoyed it. Again, like I said, this is definitely a book. I think I said this in the last clip that I will definitely like read again. Like I definitely want to read this a couple of different times. Now that I'm finished, we're gonna go to the top, and I just want to show you just how many highlights I have on this book. I'm trying to get my face out of the way so that it'll focus. There we go. So like all of this, all of these highlights, it's a lot. It's a lot. There we go. That's the end. But yeah, that's a lot of highlights. I feel like every other paragraph there was something that I wanted to highlight. And again, like I use different colors for different things. So like the purple was stuff that I want to try to apply, like as actual actionable items. Like the pink stuff was just like really good quotes that I really enjoyed. The blue stuff was kind of like general things that are important, kind of like in a textbook if something was like bold or whatever. That's kind of like what the blue is. The green stuff was stuff that was like really relatable, where I was like, ooh, okay, I didn't need you to call me out like that. That was rude. I feel like I learned a lot, but I also feel like there's so much in this book that you really can't, like I said, you can't just read it one time and think that you're going to absorb all of it. This is definitely something that you have to apply and practice on a regular basis to really make it become part of who you are. Like, you know, it's more of a lifestyle. And so I really like this. I was not expecting to like this book. I also was not expecting a book that is like less than 200 pages to be as dense and as impactful and powerful as it was. Would I recommend this to people? I think it depends on the person. I think I said this earlier, but I don't think that this is a book that just anybody should pick up. I think that, let me take that back. I think that everybody should read this, but I don't think that everybody is ready to read this. This is one of those books where like you need to be ready, you need to be in the right headspace to read and really like take in everything that it's trying to tell you or teach you. I think that this is a book that if you are not into meditation, yoga, enlightenment, you know, like vibrations, like chakras, chi, like if these are things that you are just not, like you don't care about, don't have any interest in, then maybe don't pick this up. But if you are looking for something that is going to kind of, in a slightly oversimplified way, explain to you how to make your life easier, the steps to get there are not easy, but the idea is that you take these hard steps so that you can get to a point where your life is easier and simplified, and you can kind of just go through life and like fully experience life and not get bogged down with all of the little insignificant details that we make ourselves think are important when really they're not in the grand scheme of things. I do think that if you are able to read this book and really start applying some of the stuff that's in here, I do think that like you will be a much happier, like better off person in general. So yes. So now we are going to move on to the next recommendation that I got. And the next recommendation that I got was from a human. The human we all love to hate. Mr. Matt Donovan, aka Zach Rorick. I don't know if I said his last name right, but you guys know what I'm talking about. So when I talked to Zach, Zach said that he recommended this book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It is by Viktor E. Frankl. I don't know if that's how you say the last name, but I think it is. So that is what I'm going to be reading next. This, I'm assuming, just based off of the title and like looking at the cover, I'm assuming that this is also going to be another like nonfiction. I haven't read the synopsis of this. I also don't remember if I bought this because I went to Barnes & Noble, which I'm assuming that clip you already saw, but I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought 3 out of the 4 books. And I can't remember now which one was the one that I didn't buy. But until I acquire a physical copy, I'm going to be listening to it on Libby. I have the audiobook for this, so I'm going to be starting this. This book is also short. I think this one might be shorter than the last one. This one is just under 5 hours. So again, conceptually, I feel like this should be a pretty, you know, easy book to read because it's short. But, you know, we'll see. So I have made it only a little bit into this. I think I'm like a quarter of the way into this book. I do have the physical copy, so when I went to Barnes & Noble, this was one of the ones that I got. And now I don't know which is the one that I didn't get, because there were 4 that I went in there for. I read the first one, which was Michael Trevino's book, The Untethered Soul. I have this one, and then the other one is for a different video. But now I don't remember what the 4th... Oh! I do know what the 4th one is. The fourth one might be my favorite one, not because I've read it, but because of like who it is. Yeah, they didn't have that in the store, so I'm gonna have to order it so that I have it for the next video. Anyway, back to this book. How do I talk about this book? This book is interesting. I didn't really want to know what I was getting myself into, even though maybe I should have, because I just wanted to be like surprised. I wanted it to be a fun, surprising experience and just like blindly take these people's recommendations. And maybe that was a mistake. It's not to say that this book is bad. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. But this is definitely not what I would have expected from a recommendation. Like, when you ask someone for a book recommendation, this is not what I would expect anyone to recommend someone unless they specifically ask for a certain type of book. I just kind of assumed based on the title, it's called, you know, Man's Search for Meaning. So I assumed, first of all, that it was going to be nonfiction. And I also assumed that it was going to be kind of along the same lines as the book that I got from Michael, where it was, you know, very like self-help, psychology based. Maybe a little bit of like, you know, spirituality thrown in there, you know, because it's talking about like man's search for meaning. So like, I thought it was gonna be like the same vibes, right? It is not, or at least not yet. It's like, you know, it's like a memoir, basically. This guy, Viktor E. Frankl, wrote this book about his experiences while he was in like concentration camps in Germany during the Holocaust, essentially, is what this book is about. I also am just taken aback, I guess, by the fact that this was a recommendation. If a stranger asked you for a book recommendation, like, you would give them a book about the Holocaust. I don't mean to laugh at, like, the Holocaust is not funny, but it's just, like, the fact that, like, this was the recommendation that I got. Like, I don't see myself ever I wouldn't give someone a recommendation about, like, slavery. Like, if I don't know them, that would not be the recommendation that I would give a stranger. A lot of what he has talked about, honestly, in this first 30% has a lot to do with the separation of people and like how many times, how many opportunities someone in his predicament comes basically face to face with the possibility for death. You know, I mean, technically we all come face to face with the possibility of death. Anybody could die at any moment. That's the reality of life. But like, there are so many moments where they have to go do something, and in order for them to do it, they have to like go through this selection process, and the ones that they want to keep get to stay and go on to whatever the next camp is or the next role, job, whatever. And then the ones that they don't want to keep, they just, you know, they exterminate them. And so you see that, I think that's one of the only things that I have taken away from this, is how many times they have to like basically stand there and wait for someone to swipe left or swipe right on them. It's like everything that they do, they have to be judged, and they have, you know, someone has to decide, are you good enough to stay or do we want to get rid of you? On top of the fact that the conditions that they were living in were awful. So even if you did get to stay, he even talks about the fact that a lot of them contemplated, you know, unaliving themselves, and it got to a point where they were very numb to the idea that they had to be judged and that someone had to decide, you know, yes, you get to stay, or no, we're going to get rid of you, because they felt like if they didn't make it through the selection process and they were, you know, thrown, you know, off to the side to be exterminated, it almost like it was almost like a relief for them, because it meant that they didn't have to off themselves, like someone else would do it for them. And so in some ways they saw it as a relief, which is awful and like really, really sad. But yeah, I think that was really interesting. I'm going to continue reading this. I want to try to get to 60%, because if I can get to 60% today, then that means that I have less than half that I have to get through tomorrow. And I definitely want to finish this quickly. Maybe I'll finish it tonight. I don't know. We'll see. I think I only have like 2 or 3 hours left for the audiobook, and I'm listening to it at 1.75 speed. So who knows? Maybe if I stay up long enough, I can get through the whole thing tonight. We'll see. Alright, so I'm now at 64%, which good. I'm glad that I made it to 64%. It is 11:24 at night. I still feel mostly the same way. I took some notes of things that like kind of stood out to me that was interesting that maybe I hadn't considered before, maybe is a better way of phrasing it. But he talks about, this is definitely looking at his experience as being, you know, an inmate in one of these camps, but also he's a doctor. And I think, again, I think that he's a psychiatrist or something like that. He talks about like the mindset of the prisoners, and he talks about the fact that it was very like important for them to not give up, because he talks about the connection between like your mental health and your physical health, and so how sometimes you can be so unwell mentally, like if you're like just really depressed, really sad, whatever, that you can like make yourself like physically sick. And so he gives the example of this guy that he knew, you know, in the concentration camps, who he had like a vision or something where he like thought, he was like convinced that he was going to be getting out on a certain day, and when that day rolled around they were not released. Because it didn't happen, he was so distressed, you know, like I said, depressed, distraught, that he ended up getting like physically sick, and then I think he like died the next day. And so he talks about like how important it is for them to kind of try their best to keep a positive like attitude, or as positive as you can be, you know, in the situation. Maybe not like positive, but like not giving up. And he talks about how they had to work to like encourage each other. But yeah, I'm gonna head to bed, and then I will check in with you guys probably once I've finished. I probably won't do another check-in until after I'm done with this book, because 64% in, it's not a whole lot left, and this book is short. So yeah, I think I can do just like kind of like final thoughts at the end. So I will see you once I am finished with this book. So we are back with my final thoughts on Man's Search for Meaning. So I finished this book, and this, like the other book, took a turn that I was not expecting it to take, and I definitely appreciate it, and I think that it made the book much more interesting, because up until that point I was very confused, because I thought this was a memoir, and I was just like, what a weird choice to recommend a memoir of a Holocaust survivor as a book recommendation to a stranger. Thought that was super weird, but I was like, you know what, we're gonna go with it, we're gonna see where it takes us. And I'm happy to report that this book is similar vibes to the first book, just in a sense of like, this is a book that is very much like psychology, like self-help, you know, that just like those kind of vibes. I think that in terms of like the belief systems that these two books have, they are like polar opposites, which I'll get into that in a second. But this book, I took some notes, because as it started to get more into the psychology of things, I started to actually like take notes of things. This book, although it does start off very much like a memoir of a Holocaust survivor, it actually is a book that is about a very specific type of therapy called logotherapy, which I think from what I understood from the book, this was a type of therapy that this person, like this author, like created based on his credentials as, you know, a therapist, but also his experiences having been in the concentration camps. And that is the reason why this book starts off, like the first 67% of the book starts off with him talking about his experience in the concentration camp, because I think that's kind of where this theory, or this like school of practice, kind of like evolved from, like where it kind of stemmed from originally. Much less introspective and much less retrospective, and is much more focused on like the future, the patient's meaning that is to be fulfilled in their future. It's described as being a meaning-centered psychoanalysis. And so the idea is that becoming more aware of like your meaning or your purpose in the world can help you to overcome the neuroses of life. And so it talks about the fact that there's like, you know, one school of teaching that is very much focused on like pleasure, the will versus the pleasure. And then there are other schools of practice that are focused on like superiority, striving to be superior. Whereas with logos therapy, it's more about finding one's meaning and one's purpose in life. And it is also very self-aware that that has the potential to create tension rather than equilibrium. It is not like focused on creating equilibrium, which is kind of the exact opposite of Michael A. Singer's book, because that book was all about like freedom and equilibrium and all that kind of stuff. Whereas this is kind of like very aware that like equilibrium is not necessarily the goal. It could be a side effect or a byproduct, but it's not like the end all be all goal that this therapy is like seeking to achieve. And so one of the reasons why this book talks about like his experience in the concentration camps and using the prisoners as an example is because what he observed during his time there was that the prisoners, I think I talked about this earlier, how like their mental state and their emotional state had very much a like almost direct effect on their physical state as well. And so he found that as the workers had things to look forward to, or they felt like whatever they were doing was for like the greater good, or they were contributing to something in some way in society or in life, it kind of helped them to accept their situation better. And because they were able to better accept their situation and their mental and emotional state was better, it helped to physically keep them alive as well. One of the interesting points that I think that he brings up is the idea that technology leads to depression. And the way that he kind of describes it is that with technological advances, technological progression, it makes life easier for us. That's kind of the whole point as to why technology advances, is to make our lives easier on a day-to-day. But in making our lives easier, it then frees up a lot of our time to do other things. But when you free up so much of your time that you don't then know what to do with your time, and then you're bored, that boredom then breeds depression. When you're bored, you don't have anything to look forward to, you don't have anything going on, you don't have anything to occupy you or distract you. You're kind of just left sitting there wondering, like, what am I supposed to be doing? You feel like you should be doing something and you're not. And you feel like you don't have any meaning, or you don't know what your place is or your purpose is in life. And so that then leads to depression and other, neurotic symptoms. So I thought that was an interesting point that he makes. One of the other things that I thought was interesting that he talks about is suffering. And basically, suffering no longer feels like suffering when you can find like a meaning for it. Like, if you get sick, if someone else gets sick, if someone passes away, or whatever the case may be, when you're able to reframe your thinking and see it from a different perspective, that maybe there's a good reason why things had to happen the way that they did. I hear people say all the time, if I hadn't gone through what I went through, I wouldn't be where I am today. And so it's kind of the same concept, where it's like, you are going through some type of really hard time, you are suffering in some way, but then you get to the other side of it and you see like, oh, well, this had to happen so that X, Y, and Z could happen. And it may not be that things had to happen to make your life better. It could be that maybe you had to go through something really hard so that it can make somebody else's life better. He also talks about the fact, though, that suffering just for the sake of suffering, if it's unnecessary, isn't heroic or noble. It's actually quite masochistic, which that made me immediately think about Stefan Salvatore. He also talks about anticipatory anxiety and paradoxical intention, which this was probably the section that I found the most interesting in this book. I'm probably not going to explain these concepts the best, so I definitely recommend like looking these up on your own. But for anticipatory anxiety, it's basically like, because you are anticipating something and you are nervous about something, you will actually kind of contribute to it happening. But on the flip side of that, with paradoxical intention, if you're trying to make something happen because you're trying to make it happen, it actually will prevent it from happening, which I thought was like such an interesting concept, but also like very relatable. I think the example that he gives for this is like sweating, if you're like a nervous sweater. So for like anticipatory anxiety, if you know that like going into this situation, you're going to get really nervous and you're probably going to sweat, because you're nervous that you're going to start sweating, you're probably going to start sweating. But with the paradoxical intention piece of it, it's going into the situation knowing that you're gonna sweat and like trying to make yourself sweat. So instead of going into the situation being nervous that you might sweat, you go into the situation and you say, I'm gonna sweat. I'm gonna sweat through 3 layers of clothes. And so by you trying to make yourself sweat, it would actually prevent you from being able to sweat. And so I thought that concept was really interesting, like those two together and how they work together. It talks about sleep too, when they're talking about paradoxical intention. I think another example that they gave is sleep. And so when you're laying in bed and you're trying to fall asleep, you can't fall asleep because you're trying to do it. But when you try to do something else, you're like, oh, I'm gonna try to read a book. Then you end up falling asleep. So essentially, in a nutshell, anticipatory anxiety is basically saying that you basically contribute to your own worst fears and you bring about that which you are afraid of. Whereas with paradoxical intention, you are doing it on purpose rather than trying to avoid it. And by you doing it on purpose, it basically prevents it from happening. It's like a very trippy concept. I thought it was interesting that these two books are kind of like exact opposites, because this book is all about trying to find the meaning in life and trying to find your purpose and all that kind of stuff. Whereas this book is very much like nothing matters. Like just live life, just experience it, just be in the moment. Don't try to like do too much. Don't waste your energy. Don't spin your wheels. And this book is kind of the opposite. This book sees the idea of meaninglessness being crippling, whereas this book sees meaninglessness as being freeing. And so to have read both of these books back to back and read both of these books in this video was not on purpose, because like I said, I didn't read the synopses for either of these, so I had no idea what I was going to get picking up either one. But I just think that it's so interesting that like these two things kind of like went together when they are polar opposites. I also thought that it was interesting too, because I actually messed up. Originally when I started this video, and I had to cut this part out when I was editing, but originally when I started this video, my plan was to read a book from a werewolf and a book from a vampire. And then I ended up mistakenly reading a book from a werewolf and a book from a human. That was not on purpose. But these two characters in the show are best friends. So for these books to be like on polar opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of psychoanalysis, I just thought that was so interesting that like these besties on screen recommended me two very different, two very opposing books. As far as which one I liked better, I definitely liked this one better. I think that this one, for me personally, I feel like this one spent too much time going into the author's backstory. I think that this book could have been a lot stronger if it focused on the psychology part and less on like the memoir part. I understand why he gives you that context, so that when he starts giving you examples, once you get to the psychology piece of it, you have like examples to kind of fall back on because you read about what he's talking about earlier in the book. But I do think that you could have done without it. I feel like I prefer this way of thinking. I think that while I agree that trying to find the meaning in things does help people, I think that when you can find a justifiable reason why something awful happens, it definitely helps you to accept that awful situation much better. I think that that's something that we as humans do every day, like all the time, and we're not even thinking about it. People do it all the time. They don't even realize that they're doing it. It's not even like it's a novel idea. It's kind of just, this is what humans do all the time, and he's just kind of pointing it out. But I think that to go through life constantly trying to find the meaning in life, trying to find your purpose, trying to understand like the reasoning behind different things that happen, to me, in my opinion, that takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of effort, and it's very exhausting. And he says that doing that helps you to combat neuroses, but in my opinion, I feel like it almost contributes more to it, or at least that has been my experience. And I think that it is more of a distraction, it is more of a coping mechanism. Whereas like with this book, I feel like this book is just like, don't take things too seriously. Just enjoy life, enjoy the ride, accept things as they happen. Stop trying to control everything all the time. Stop trying to understand everything all the time. And as somebody who has very high functioning anxiety, I think that going through life trying to figure out the meaning of things all the time just takes way more work. I want to be able to just enjoy life and live it and not try to analyze it all the time. I do also think that finding your purpose in life, or trying to find your meaning in life, could also have like its downsides, because I feel like, let's say you do figure out like what you're here, like what you're put on this earth to do, I feel like that could contribute negatively to your mental state, because I feel like it just kind of puts unnecessary pressure on someone to feel like, oh, this is what I'm here to do, because every time you don't do that, you don't accomplish it, then you feel like you're a failure by default. So yeah, I just feel like this book requires too much energy, and this is all about not putting energy into things. This is going to be one that I will read again. This is not one that I would read again. So yeah, those are my final thoughts on these two books. I am definitely very grateful to have read both of them. I think that it was very interesting having read them. So yeah, I had a good time with this experience, but I would not read this book again. But thank you to Michael, thank you to Zach for recommending me these books. And yeah, let me know down below in the comments if you guys decide to pick up either one of these, or if you have read them already, let me know down below what your thoughts were on them. And with that, that is the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you made it this far into the video, drop a wolf emoji in honor of the book that I actually ended up liking more in this video. Drop the wolf emoji down below in the comments. I guess the next video is going to be me reading a vampire recommendation and a witch recommendation. So stay tuned for that, because that will be coming next. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.